Columbus's first voyage to America. After finally convincing a friend at the Spanish court to finance his expedition, Columbus set off sailing west to find a new route to Asia. Luckily, he was forced to depart from the Canary Islands, which positioned his ship south enough to benefit from the trade winds, which blew him across the Atlantic Ocean. In Columbus's diary, we read that the anxiety among his men already started the moment they sailed far enough to lose sight of land. To keep his men in check, Columbus consistently lied about the distance they had sailed, making his crew believe that they were actually closer to home than they truly were. After weeks at sea, a mix of apprehension and optical illusions gave them a number of false sightings of land, but each time they were disappointed, until his crew was ready to mutiny. But then they found an island which they called San Salvador, where they were immediately met by friendly natives, the so-called Taino. In his diary, Columbus described them as beautiful, extremely generous, but also docile, and he quickly found out that their islands were often raided by the cannibalistic Caribs, who regularly took the Taino as slaves. Journeying from island to island, including Cuba, Columbus frequently misinterpreted clues, convincing him that he had truly reached Asia, while in fact, of course, he had reached America. On his return back home, Columbus was beaten home by one of his captains, who then attempted to take credit for his discovery. So, we have a lot to discuss. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. In 1492, Columbus departed from the Canary Islands, which were in the hands of Spain. Geographically, the Azores seem to be a more obvious departure point, as these islands are located further off from the European coast. But those islands were in the hands of their competitor, Portugal. But as luck would have it, a departure from the Canary Islands gave them access to the trade winds, while a departure from the Azores would have resulted in failure. After 3 days of sailing, we read in Columbus's diary that every trace of land had disappeared. About this momentous event, Columbus wrote in his log, "This day we completely lost sight of land, and many men sighed and wept for fears that they would not see it again. And I comforted them with great promises of land and riches." To estimate the distance covered, Columbus guessed his speed by following bubbles or gulfweed as it floated by, which an experienced sailor can do quite accurately. But to not upset his crew, he consistently reported a lower distance, making his crew believe that they were less far from home. Although, ironically, we now know that the reported distance was actually closer to the correct value. During the journey, Columbus and his crew were often tricked by false indications that land was close. Mid-ocean, they saw 2 birds fly over, and a little later they found a piece of gulfweed and a crab. But this was false alarm. Soon the gulfweed was everywhere. There was so much that they even feared that the boat might get stuck, but luckily this didn't happen. They had reached the Sargasso Sea, where there isn't a strong current, so where that gulfweed can slowly grow. On another occasion, the captain of the Pinta, Martin Alonso Pinzon, yelled out, "Land, land, sir! I claim the reward," referring to the reward given to the first person to spot land. Columbus then fell on his knees to thank God, and the crew sang Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory to the highest God. But unfortunately, it was again false alarm. And by the way, sailors were known for their religious piety, performing prayers and singing psalms at intervals during the day. They were often extremely religious, as they were at the mercy of the natural forces of the sea. And Columbus, even more than others, was often described as a pious Christian throughout his life. He saw his religious attitude about the sea reflected in Psalm 107. we read, "They that go down the sea in ships and occupy their business in great waters, these men see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For at his word the stormy wind ariseth, and lifted up the waves thereof." After days and days had gone by, the crew became anxious. What if food and water would run out? Columbus had to calm his crew down, reminding them again of the great wealth of India, and also of the favors they would receive back home. And these promises worked for the moment. At some point, Columbus had covered his estimated distance to where he thought Japan would be. But still, there was no land in sight. So even he must have gotten anxious by that time. A few days later, the anxiety among his men turned into open mutiny. This time, Columbus promised to return within 2 or 3 days, in case they would not sight land. But then, things finally turned in their favor. A flock of birds flew over, which they decided to follow, which turned out to be a good call. A little later, the boat Ninja picked up a green branch with a little flower, and Pinta even found a carved stick, which they believed must have been carved by an Indian. And then, before sunrise, Columbus saw a light in the distance, which was then confirmed by another crew member. We read, "It was like a little wax candle rising and falling." Then someone else also saw the light and screamed that they had found land. But whatever they saw, it again turned out to be false alarm. Although this sighting somehow won Columbus the prize for being the first to spot land. Later, Rodrigo de Triana, a crew member of the Pinta, reported a white sand cliff gleaming in the moonlight, and then another one, and then a dark line connecting them. "Tierra, tierra! Land, land!" he shouted, and Martin Alonso Pinzon then fired a gun to alert the other ships. As soon as Columbus approached him with his ship, he shouted, "Señor Martin Alonso, you have found land!" After 33 days of sailing, close to 5 weeks, they had finally reached an island of the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. We read in his diary, "Presently they saw naked people, and the Admiral, that is Columbus, went ashore in the armed ship's boat, with the royal standard displayed. So did the captains of Pinta and Ninja. And, all having rendered thanks to God, kneeling on the ground, embracing it with tears of joy, for the immeasurable mercy of having reached it, the Admiral arose and gave this island the name San Salvador. Thereupon he summoned to him the 2 captains, and all others who came ashore as witnesses. And in the presence of many natives of that land assembled together, they took possession of the island, in the name of the Catholic sovereigns, with appropriate words and ceremony. They called the naked people they encountered Indians, after the Indies, which at the time referred to Asia as a whole. The first encounter, we read, was very friendly. Columbus wrote, "In order that we might form a great friendship, for I knew that they were a people who could be more easily freed and converted to our holy faith by love than by force. I gave to some of them red caps and glass beads to put around their necks, and many other things of little value which gave them great pleasure, and made them so much our friends that it was a marvel to see. They afterwards came to the ship's boats, where we were, swimming and bringing us parrots, cotton threads in knots, darts and many other things. And we exchanged them for other things that we gave them, such as those glass beads and small bells. In fine, they took all and gave what they had with good will." He continued, "It appeared to me to be a race of people very poor in everything. They go as naked as when their mothers bore them, and so do the women. All I saw were youths, none more than 30 years of age. They are very well made, with very handsome bodies and very good countenances. Their hair is short and coarse, almost like the hairs of a horse's tail. They wear the hair brought down to the eyebrows, except of a few locks behind, which they wear long and never cut. They paint themselves black, and they are the color of the Canaries, that is the indigenous people of the Canary Islands. They were neither black nor white, so somewhere in between. Some paint themselves white, others red, and others of what color they find. Some paint their faces, others their whole body. Some only around the eyes, and others only on the nose. And they neither carry nor know anything about arms. For I showed them swords, and they took them by the blade and cut themselves through ignorance. And they have no iron, their darts being wands without iron, some of them having a fish's tooth at the end, and others being pointed in various ways. At a later time, the natives approached their ships in dugouts, which are fashioned like a long boat from the trunk of a tree, and all in one piece, and wonderfully made, and so big that in some came 40 or 45 men. Hilariously, Columbus had hyped himself up so much by fake reports of fantastical beasts in faraway places, that he also wrote in his diary, "In the island so far I have found no monsters, as some expected." Columbus soon learned that the natives, the Taino, were a bit too friendly for their own good, as they were no match for the neighboring Caribs who occasionally raided them from the Caribbean islands and took them as slaves. We read, "I saw some with marks of wounds on their bodies, and I made signs to ask what it was, and they gave me to understand that people from other adjacent islands came with the intention of seizing them, and that they had to defend themselves. I believed and still believe that they come here from the mainland to take them prisoners. But as it later turned out, they came from other islands, not from the mainland, as Columbus had hoped." To his disappointment, not much gold was found on the island, except for some small nose jewelry. As a result, Columbus returned to sea, taking with him 6 natives as guides and translators, and his biographer Las Casas, who would become a great defender of the natives, rightly so saw this as kidnapping. But of course they needed the information of the locals to navigate in the area. They then went from one island to the next. On one of these islands they found a man wearing a big gold nose plug with letters on it, which Columbus hoped might be Chinese or Japanese. Interested in the object, Columbus offered to trade, but the native did not want to part with it, and Columbus had no intention of taking it by force. Finally, they reached a much larger island, which the natives called Colba, now called Cuba. The center of Cuba was called Cubanacan, but Columbus misheard it as El Gran Khan, the title of the Mongol rulers of China, which convinced him that he had indeed reached India. And at the time, by the way, he did not yet know that Cuba was also an island. It could have been mainland Asia, he thought. He then sent an embassy to the middle of Cuba, hoping to meet the Emperor of China there. But the embassy only found a small village. They did find a large house in that village, within it beautifully carved seats. And when they entered that house, women and children kissed their feet and hands, believing them to be, quote, men from heaven. And here they were also introduced to nicotine for the first time, and they also found small amounts of gold. Columbus then discovered the island Hispaniola, which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There the crew captured a woman with another golden nose plug, who later turned out to be the daughter of a local leader. But they then, quote, sent her ashore honorably, although she declared that she would rather stay with the man from heaven. When the man reached the shore, they found a large village, and they were soon surrounded by 2,000 natives. And again Columbus remarked on how docile these people were. He wrote, "For I, with these people aboard my ship, who are not many, could overrun all these islands without opposition. For they bear no arms, and are all unprotected, and so very cowardly that 1,000 would not face 3. So they are fit to be ordered about and made to work, and we can teach them to go clothed and to adopt our customs." Which is the first quote by Columbus that starts to reek a little bit of slavery, although that was not his intention here yet. The docility of the Taino would later be exploited ruthlessly. In fact, the only Native Americans of the Caribbean to survive in any significant number were those natives willing to defend themselves. When Columbus went ashore on a different part of Hispaniola, the Santa Maria, his own ship, hit a coral reef and shipwrecked, A friendly local Taino leader would then, quote, from time to time visit the weeping Admiral, referring to Columbus, in order to console him, very friendly. He entered Nina and, almost weeping, said that he must not show grief, that he would give him all he had, and that he had given the Christians who were ashore 2 very big houses, and would give them more if necessary. To such extent are they loyal and without greed for the property of others. And we continue, 4 pieces of gold as big as the hand were brought. The Taino king rejoiced to see the Admiral happy. He would give him as much gold as he wanted, he said. Using the planks of the Santa Maria, Columbus then built a tower and a fortress, and they named their settlement La Navidad. The center of Hispaniola was called Cibao, which Columbus again mistook for something else, in this case Cipango or Japan. And Columbus was told by the natives that there was a great quantity of gold there. On an expedition there, he indeed found the first virgin gold in a river, which he therefore named Rio del Oro, the River of Gold. There he also discovered what he believed to be mermaids, although we read, they were not as beautiful as they were painted. They were in fact sea cows based on the description. On his last stop on Hispaniola, which they called Las Flechas or the Arrows, they had their first dangerous encounter with the natives. There they were shot at by, in their words, very ugly natives whose faces were stained with charcoal and who wore parrot feathers in their hair. Columbus then returned home, leaving the crew of the shipwrecked Nina behind at the fort La Navidad, hoping to pick them up on a second journey. The ride home was much tougher than the outward journey due to bad weather. For days and days, heavy storms caused cold water to smash on the deck, from which Columbus developed arthritis, which crippled him for the rest of his life. And during the storm, Columbus also lost sight of the Pinta. Its captain, Martin Alonso Pinzon, reached Spain first, and then contacted the sovereigns, hoping to take credit for the discovery of the new route to Asia. But luckily for Columbus, the monarchs declined to meet Pinzon, waiting to hear from the Admiral Columbus himself. Later, after Columbus's death, the crown would use Pinzon's testimony in an attempt to take away Columbus's titles, which by that time had gone over to his son. But that is a story for another time. Columbus had also taken the native guides with him to Spain, and he showed them to the public in Seville. In the public was his later biographer Bartolomé de las Casas, who was at the time just a young boy. Las Casas would later become a slave owner in the early parts of his life, but he later developed a strong conviction that the natives were their equals and that they should be treated humanely. He strongly criticized the excesses of the later colonizers, and he also critiqued Columbus quite harshly when he went astray, although Las Casas generally respected him, especially compared to his successors. He described Columbus as a devout Christian and a kind man, although he too would make crucial mistakes, as we will later find out. Casas eventually managed to convince the crown to demand better treatment of the natives, and he even got Pope Paul III to issue the Sublimis Deus, which stated that Indians were fully rational human beings who should not be enslaved, who have the right to property, and who should only be brought to the faith peacefully. But the colonizers, in response, banished Las Casas from Hispaniola. In 1522, he started his own colony in Venezuela, where he intended to treat the natives with respect, but the mission turned out to be a disaster. The natives in fact burned down his community and nearly killed everyone. For, as we will soon learn, not all the natives were friendly either. Back home in Spain, Las Casas would continue to lobby for equal rights for the natives. In 1542 he even won a case against slavery, although it was repealed the same year under the pressure of powerful landowners and nobles. Now let's return to the main story. In Spain, the natives that Columbus had brought were baptized, and they then headed back home on Columbus's second voyage to America. Although only 2 of them survived the trip, I assume that the rest died of disease. One exception was a native who was named Don Juan by Columbus. He stayed in Spain with the monarchs, but he too died 2 years later. again very likely of disease. By that time, both Portugal and Spain had found their own trade routes to the Indies. Portugal by sailing east and Spain by sailing west, to what was in fact actually America instead of Asia, of course. Both being satisfied with their own trade routes, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided up the world among the Spanish and the Portuguese. The treaty described a dividing line across the Atlantic Ocean, midway between Cape Verde, on the African coast, and Hispaniola. Any new lands to the east of this line would become part of Portugal, while all the lands to the west would become part of Spain. And notice here that the yet undiscovered Brazil was on the side of Portugal, and that is why to this day people speak Portuguese in Brazil and Spanish in the rest of South America. And thus we conclude the first voyage of Columbus. In the next lecture we'll discuss his other 3 voyages, where things spiral out of control. Columbus came back with a fleet of 1,000 men, but when they returned to Hispaniola, they found the Spaniards who stayed behind brutally killed by the natives. They then set out to build a permanent settlement on Hispaniola, but this was also way harder than expected. It was very hard work with little progress, and then sickness spread and the natives also attacked. The revolt was eventually put down and the captured enemies were sent back to Spain as slaves. When Columbus was away on exploration, those he put in charge misused their power, inflicting heavy punishments on both their own people and also on the natives, gravely damaging the relation with the natives. Eventually, Columbus, in desperate need of money, forced the natives to pay tribute in gold, which they had to find through hard labor. During the 3rd voyage, Columbus reached mainland South America for the first time, where they found the first evidence of more sophisticated civilizations, and they even found a mummy. But then, a Spanish inspector came over and found Columbus's colony in complete disarray, for which Columbus was brought back to Spain in chains. On his last voyage, Columbus's ship, which was by the time infested with worms and filled up with water, ran aground on Jamaica, where they were stranded for a whole year. So, stay tuned for the next lecture. But for now, if you want to know more about these voyages of discovery, or any other topic from world history, read my book, In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.